Good evening, good evening, good evening, and welcome to CMind's Healing Higher Education, Race Reckoning, and Reimagining series. Tonight, we will be focusing on reimagining contemplative practice at the community college. My name is David Robinson Morris. I'm CMind's Executive Director, and we'll begin with a brief practice. Wherever you find yourselves in the world, find a comfortable place. If you're in your chair, sit comfortably, feet on the ground, hands relaxed. Take a deep breath in. Exhale. Take a deep breath in. Exhale. Take in the deepest breath you've taken all day. Exhale. Deep breath. Exhale. Follow the rhythm of your breath. Notice in gratitude how your chest rises and falls out of love for you. Relish in the wiggling of your toes. Focus on your ears. Open your heart. Listen and luxuriate in the words of Mary Oliver's Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about your despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Deep breath in. Exhale. You are here. Ashe. As we bring ourselves back to focus, I want to wish you all again a good evening and welcome you to tonight's event, Reimagining Contemplative Practice at the Community College. This is the third conversation in the Healing Higher Education, Race Reckoning, and Reimagining series. Again, my name is David Robinson Morris, and I'm pleased to serve as the Executive Director in service to the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, more commonly known as CMind. The Center for Contemplative Mind is a global community of practitioners and scholars working at the intersection of contemplative justice and higher education to inspire, to engage, and to support the integration of contemplative practices and understandings in our everyday living toward the development of a more just world, a deepened understanding of our shared humanity, responsibility to the planet, and the production of new knowledges. CMind convenes conferences, we organize seminars, lectures, we facilitate workshops, and we form communities of practice with relevant experts, scholars, and practitioners from and with diverse interests and backgrounds. We envision ourselves as a conduit of individual, collective, systemic, and institutional transformation, where society is formed through an active engagement in contemplative practices and understandings, which makes possible radical healing, human flourishing, and collective liberation. We envision institutions of higher learning and a society that practices compassion, that pursues justice, and acts in ways that honor our shared humanity. Tonight's program and this series is but a small glimpse into the work we are endeavoring to do to make radical healing and human flourishing possible. As you may know, April is not only National Poetry Month, but it's also National Community College Month. Did not know that until I did my research last night. So I'm thrilled that we are having this conversation tonight. Community colleges, in my opinion, are the sites of collision. They are sites where the American dream collides with the American promise of education. The students at community colleges are not traditional 18 to 21-year-olds always. They are students who come to and/or come back to their educational journeys after working in the world, trying to make ends meet, after birthing and raising children and taking care of loved ones. Community college students are each of us, like each of us, are wounded, worn by life, and determined in the pursuit of better, of more, while trying to juggle the educational journey, living full, dynamic lives charged with responsibility. Each community college student, I would argue, believes at some level in the power of education as a primary method in the pursuit of the American dream. Equally, community college professors and staff, especially those that I know and those that are here tonight, see their positions as more than a job, but a vocation, a calling to affirm through the educative journey the ability and fullness of their students who are overcoming amazing odds to obtain their educations. Teaching is a glorious undertaking and learning a transformative experience. However, community colleges, one strata in the higher education ecosystem, are equally as complicit at times in the infliction of wounds among those engaged in the system. As I've reminded you each week, healing is a practice and a continuous process. Healing systems is a continuous process of embodiment, of making incarnate the transformation toward wholeness and engendering compassion within ourselves, so that this attunement in mind and body and spirit alters every environment in which we find ourselves planted. However, nothing can be healed until it is faced, and nothing is faced in earnest until we tell the truth about it. The central question of our whole series, right, is this. Given the current state of higher education, how might we catalyze a healing to transform higher ed into what it is not yet, but must become if we are to live together peacefully, respect the planet, and uplift the human spirit? Tonight, our presenters will shed light on the wounds, their own practices of healing and transformation, and how they put the imagination, which I call the realm of infinite possibility, into the practice of transformation. Now, enough of my babble. Please allow me to introduce tonight's guest. CMind board member Stephanie Briggs is the owner and designer of Be Still Move, a program of contemplative, compassionate, just community building. She's a space holder, storyteller, contemplative creator, and a coach whose practices include embodied movement, art, and sound. She is trained in sound healing, Reiki, and is a Stevens minister. She completed Naropa University's Authentic Leadership and Mindful Compassion training, and is the creator of Authentic Collaborative Leadership and Breathing into Blackness. Board member Amy Pacino is an associate professor of sociology at the Community College of Baltimore County, where she is also engaged in the contemplative community circle of faculty and staff who share contemplative practices with each other and with students. Amy is trained in teaching meditation with the Mindfulness Center of Maryland. And Marlon Blake currently works as the Assistant Dean of Students at the University of St. Thomas. Marlon has spent the last 12 years in higher education, serving in various leadership roles. Marlon's current research emphasis focuses on how faculty members use contemplative pedagogy in the classroom. He's currently researching how these practices can better support community colleges and improve academic outcomes. Without further ado, I turn it over to our presenters. Thank you all and welcome.
Thank you everyone for being here. I'm Amy Pacino, and I'm happy to share space with Marlon and Stephanie and David. And behind the scenes are Karen and Carrie, and they've sort of been instrumental in putting this whole thing together. So I have a lot of gratitude for who we're sharing space with today. And then folks who are here as part of this Zoom sphere, right, in this new world that we're in. I have family here. I'm gonna blow a kiss to my family. And we have Marlon and Stephanie, and I have colleagues and friends and community. We have folks from across the country who represent different community colleges. And we have folks from CMind. And if I didn't mention your affiliation or who you are, if you could post in the chat and share so that we know sort of who's in our community today. And we welcome each other, and we're grateful for sharing space. So over the course of these Healing Higher Education series, we've asked the question, David's asked the question, when we're looking for a remedy for healing, we ask ourselves, what is the wound? I appreciate the idea of the community college as a space of collision and looking at the beauty and the challenge that that presents to us, right? As we look at the remedies and the wounds, and we're honest about both and creative with both. So today, to introduce ourselves, we're going to each share about a contemplative practice that we've had to address a wound, and then how we see those contemplative practices playing out in our learning communities. And before I do that, I know that we have a lot of folks in the room. Some of us are contemplatives, others are also contemplatives, but maybe it's useful to share some of the language from our sort of Bible of contemplative practice in higher education by Daniel Barbizet and Mirbai Bush, right? Contemplative practices are those with an inward first-person focus that create opportunities for greater connection and insight. The practices focus on the present experience, either physical or mental. They place the individual at the center of their learning so that they can connect to their inner world with the outer world. And through this experience, learning is transformed. And you can see the tree of contemplative practice, where maybe many of us think of contemplative practices as meditation or centering, but there are, of course, just tons on the tree and off the tree, right? Storytelling, retreats, beholding, dance, right? All of these things that help us connect to ourselves, connect to each other, and build empathy. So in terms of my own practice that heals wounds, I came to contemplative practice without knowing it as a thing. I struggle with anxiety, and particularly social anxiety. As someone that's a very sensitive person, this was hard for me because I would have so many feelings to share and an inability to feel like I could articulate them. So I started writing thank you notes, and that was a sort of my gratitude practice and my way to connect with people and share what was going on inside in a way that was contemplative for myself, could build a connection, sort of uncover what I was feeling, and also build a connection with someone in my community. And so this gratitude practice helped me to articulate what was so hard to verbally articulate. And so through writing, through contemplative writing, through free writing, through gratitude writing, I felt like I was addressing this wound. This practice can translate with your children, right? It translates into my classroom. There's lots of ways to use contemplative writing. We'll do free writes before we go over the syllabus and sort of like, okay, could you think of people have had all kinds of empowering and disempowering educational experiences. So can we write about one ahead of going into the sort of nitty gritty of the semester that causes so much anxiety? Right? Thinking about writing to our child selves or our ancestors, or writing solutions, writing our imagination, right? These are all ways we can use practice, the practice of writing, something that helped me heal a wound in a space collectively together for learning. So thank you, I'm happy to be here today.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Briggs, and so good to see you all. Well, not really. I can't see you all, but I feel you all. I feel you all. So please let us know where you're from, because I'm looking at the chat and I want to know. So this question was really interesting. You know, when did I discover I had a wound that needs to be healed, and that I had a practice? And so I started thinking about in 1974. This is when I started giving my age. I was a sophomore at NYU in the School of the Arts, and I was a costume designer. And it was a really difficult year. I mean, I was a first gen, overwhelmed, I was depressed, and I was in and out and on the edge. So I decided I was going to take a year off. And there was a reason that I was taking a year off. But there was no term for what was happening to me. But what my mother said was, since whatever was happening to me was a taboo topic, I promised her that no one would ever know that I was not in college. So 15 years later, I would return to school, and this time to the new school in New York. And I was an office assistant, and therefore I could get free education. And I was told by my advisor that, you know, since you've been out of school for so long, take 2 courses. One that is for fun, and one that is required. And do this for the next 2 semesters. And the 2 courses I took happened to be Alexander Technique and the History of Buddhism. And the History of Buddhism talked about the shamanic. And I was intrigued by that. It was music, movement, healing. And it was, you know, just what I was looking for. I needed to heal. And then the Alexander Technique was about breath and sounding and opening up areas closed down in the body that needed to be opened. And then I was introduced to meditation. And then I started to realize that the stories that I carried were not my stories. And so I went into a deep healing process and majored in, you know, like I said, creative writing, and found a way through storytelling to say what I needed to say. The practice then carried over into my teaching at the Community College of Baltimore County. And I was using verbal storytelling and using music and sound. And then I was also using physical storytelling, which was movement and dance. And I knew that there were different approaches to how I could teach. And I wanted to do it lightly and joyfully, and to sort of remove obstacles from students so they could be more free to think and speak for themselves. So I now share these same sort of practices. I'll talk more about these later, but I now share them with in mindfulness practices that I do for the STEM community, and which, those of you who know me, STEM is not where I would be, but it's an undergraduate STEM program where the focus is on the retention of African American students. And we use mindfulness for me to teach the faculty and the administration how to look at the complexities of STEM, and how the complexities of STEM are actually causing pain and suffering. We also look at, the fact that some students of color may not have had the same experiences, had the same opportunities, did not have the same kind of educational, technological opportunities. They're good students, but didn't have what other students had. And then I also teach faculty to understand not only about themselves, but about race, history, and other personal trauma that they carry, that they need to come to terms with so they can recognize it in the students that they serve. So this is sort of the physical and non-verbal, because I like non-verbal storytelling. I don't want to use words. Non-verbal storytelling practice that I use from my experience in 1974. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie and Amy, for allowing me to participate in this journey. And I think one of the things I think about this question about when we discovered the practice to heal a wound. And I think for me, my first year in my doctoral program, is the first year I ever was like, oh, this is what this is called. It was like the first time I was ever to name it, right? And I think what was already pointed out, I think a lot of us grew up in cultures and communities where there are these contemplative practices, but it's never called that, right? Like, oh, you need to come in the house by the time the street light comes on. There's these like symbols that we're like, oh, street light's coming on, gotta go in, right? Or you need to go stand in the corner and think about what you just did, right? And those ideas of setting the of quietness and centering allows us that time to kind of reflect on what we did. And so I think for me, when I think about the heel that was wounded, I'll tell this story about going to the Boys and Girls Club when I was young. And for those who know me, know that I love my mother dearly, and I'm a mama's boy. And I had to go to the Boys and Girls Club one summer, and I cried. I cried the whole time I was there. Didn't go in the classroom, cried the whole time. So the director's name is Mr. Larry Dickens. He's like, all right, you can just come with me. So I just hung out with Mr. Larry. I was like, this is cool. I went to T-ball games and all this stuff. And one time he had to go to a meeting. He was like, look, you can't go to this meeting. So you got to go hang out with these older kids. And I was like, all right, cool. I guess I'll go hang out with them. Now I was like 8, and they were probably like 14, but I was like, they like 50, yo, but they were much older than I. But one of the things is they taught me how to play spades. And spades was probably the first time where I really learned about other people, about being aware of what cards had gotten played, being able to communicate indirectly with your partner through a little bit of, I got a foreign possible here. But playing spades was actually the first time where I really, in some ways, when you think about this wound, like I was just like wanted to not be in this classroom, and I needed a little healing. And so I think hanging out with those older folks at the Boys and Girls Club really helped me to feel connected and have a place to feel like I belonged. And so when I think about these idea about when I first had this wound, and then I reflect on all these things I did as when I was younger around, having, mantras on my wall, or the things that I watched really was always about how can I heal a wound and to be optimistic and look forward to the future. And so I definitely think that all of us have, in some ways, probably had much earlier wounds that we were not aware of because we aren't often able to name it in those ways. And so I definitely think for me, that's one of the first times I think about being at the Boys and Girls Club and playing spades as an opportunity. And so, and I think as this kind of plays out in this community college context, I think for me, I really appreciate and honor the work that happens at community colleges. And I think the research that I have done and understanding about this context, community colleges are often best situated to implement practices such as contemplative practice when you think about the communities and the context in which community colleges are situated. And so I definitely think there are many opportunities for it to work and to be implemented throughout the curriculum and as a part of the culture. And I also want to recognize that I think there's probably more work that's happening than we all know, but it's really about how do we understand that in the larger context. Because again, sometimes we can feel like we're on an island, but we're really not. And so I definitely think that community colleges and how I can see this playing out, our play are is really about community colleges are really centered uh, to be those places for learning and to implementation of mindfulness practices. So 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 when thinking about this community college, kind of the context here, and most of the people may be from community colleges from what I saw in the chat. So some of this may be new or not new to you, but I think for our conversation tonight, it's really important for us to think about the context of community colleges and what they offer. And I think what David pointed out earlier to us is that often community colleges are places of redemption, second chances, to way to go back and start over. And community colleges are often the backbone of our country because they do allow people the opportunity to start over or to have a reset or a fresh start. And so, more than half of the students today in this country have at least once attended a community college, if that's to take one class, start a degree or not. And one third of all the students who are enrolled at community in college are actually enrolled in the community college. I think some of the things that make community college unique is that more often they have more part-time students, first generation students, students who are on Pell Grants, students who are working, if that be part-time or full-time. Those are some of the things that make our community colleges often a little different. And as David pointed out, our non-traditional students who may have families or maybe grandparents who are coming back to school for the first time. And so the community college is really um, probably more representative of our country than most of the four-year institutions walking around here. And so, because they are representative of a multitude of communities and people who are, again, working towards that American promise, as David pointed out. But on the flip side of that, I do think that there are as some wounds that community colleges do have. When you think about the graduation rates and the retention rates of community college students, more often than not, it takes most students more than 6+ years to finish some form of credential. Now, again, part of that could be to the fact that they are part time and there are other things going on in their lives. But I do think as practitioners and educators and administrators within the community college context, we do have to ask ourselves what is it about this experience that often are having students taking a longer time to complete their degrees. And I also want to acknowledge that often we do have students in our communities who are housing insecure, who have food insecurity, who are suffering from live in communities where climate change has impacted them more greatly than other communities. Often may find themselves in communities where police brutality and other harms of violence, poverty are really can sometimes be more salient in some of our communities and the students that we find at the community college. And then I think there's the idea of the staff members who are at community colleges are often overworked and undervalued. And so when we think about these other wounds of community college, as you'll probably hear from all of us, a lot of us came to this work because we were being wounded by the places in which we worked. And so I do think it's important that we recognize that staff members and faculty members, administrators are also have wounds and are wounded by these community colleges. And so I definitely think that there's a lot of beauty and there's a lot of struggle in this experience that we call the community college. But again, I definitely think that contemplative practices can play an important role in helping us to be innovative and to start to heal some of those wounds.
And looking at sort of what Marlon has shared within the context of the last couple of years, right? So as we're talking about community colleges and the use of contemplative practices within these spaces, we're also looking at the larger social context, which sort of touched on with looking at the experience of climate, the experience of inequity in relationship to the criminal justice system, et cetera. Just a couple of years ago, right, contemplative practices looked a lot different than they do today. This was at my community college, the Community College of Baltimore County. A couple of years ago, we were doing conferences for students, these sort of vibrant experiences. CMind, Michelle Chapman came and keynoted one, and Lenwood Heyman came and keynoted another. And we had students that were able to do what you're seeing here, right? And be together. And then all of a sudden, right, we're looking at a much different circumstance. This was a post from one of my friends that I thought was so poignant for what we as educators and staff people face in the college setting right now, and wondering when we're in the Zoom sphere, who are we talking to? Are people there, right? Right. This is how we're having parties these days. This is how we're engaging these days with our students. And thinking about, issues of access, technological access, issues of how are we communicating with our students? Are we building community with our students? Even before we talk about, can we share contemplative practices, right? So lots changed in the last couple of years for our spaces, and of course, the whole world over. Multiple wars taking place in climate change, looking at the displacement of people, and various, global issues that we see represented on our campuses. And then the racial justice movements. We've seen, of course, they've been ongoing, but a sort of reemergence of those conversations on our campuses, right? And Angela Davis's famous quote, "In a racially unjust world, what good is mindfulness?" So what good is mindfulness? What good is contemplative practice, in our community colleges within the context of a global pandemic, right? With all of the social problems we face and also all of the beauty across the world over. So we decided, as so many of us at the community college sort of had to do, we got to go back to the drawing board. How do we reimagine contemplative practices at the community college now? And so over the last couple of slides, we covered a lot of, I think, stuff. And so I want us to sort of spend time together with whatever kind of is coming up as we talk about, the context of the globe that we're a part of, the context of the communities that we're a part of, right? So if we could go ahead and take just a minute together to sort of sit with this notion of the context of the community college within our local community, within our national community, within our global community, and how we might reimagine ourselves as contemplatives in that space. Stephanie taught me that you can count your breaths for a minute. And then if you know how many breaths you take in that minute, then anytime you need a beat, you need a minute, you can count that number of breaths. So for the next minute, I know that it takes me 10 breaths for a minute. So I'll be doing that. And I hope you find anything you'd like to do with this time and space. But let's just take a minute together. Thank you. So to reimagine, we've done research, we've engaged in practice, we've talked to our communities. You probably have too. We'd love to share ideas across our communities of community colleges of how we are reimagining our experience now.
Thank you, Amy. And I definitely think that it's really for me and listening to you in that moment, I think if I'll speak for myself. From my perspective, I think if there's one thing I hope that people take from this experience, I think when we believe and think about reimagining the community colleges and thinking about our wounds and how we heal those, that always starts with us. And I definitely think that it's important that we understand that on this journey of reimagining and healing, that we are centered in that, and it starts with us. Oftentimes, I think we're taught to look external for the solutions, but more often than not, those solutions are within us. And I definitely think that leads us to really thinking about this slide here. And when I did my research, I got the pleasure, I keep my research in me. An institution within the northeast of this country. I had the pleasure of going to study some colleagues of mine and friends who did contemplative practices as a community in a community college setting. And I think walking into that experience, I wasn't sure about what I was really going to learn. But the one thing I did learn before I left there, and I think was probably the most salient thing about my research, and what I think is the most important when I talk to faculty members and even students today, is that you really need to have your own practice. And so when we think about this idea of reimagining and looking forward, contemplative practices and mindfulness can allow us the opportunity to be able to sit with what could the future look like? Or it allows us the space and time to say, how am I playing a role in the wounds that are continuing? So I definitely think it's important from my perspective, if you're on this journey of this community college mindfulness, it's important that you have your own practice. And I think being consistent within that practice. And so that means ensuring that you have a good community of people with the technology of Zoom and group chats and WhatsApp and all these things. We often can find ourselves being able to be more accountable because I can send a quick text message and say, how was your practice today? And so I definitely think when we think about this idea of reimagining and looking forward for our institutions, I think it first starts with the question of what is my practice and how does my practice influence how I reimagine the university? And so I think the last example I'll give is this example about how this may play out. So when we think about the experience that students have, grading is a fundamental aspect particularly for faculty members and how students think about their experience at college. If you get an A, college is going well. You get an F, college is going terrible, right? But oftentimes, an A, a B, a C, depending on who's reading it, is a very subjective thing. So when I think about when I'm grading papers, the first thing I do is I find my time to center myself, because I know if I'm having a frustrating day or some things are not going right in my household, or I'm just really excited, I might be giving out a few grades that usually get a B plus. Everybody get an A today. Or sometimes a student who may get a B plus, you're getting a C minus today because I'm in my feelings about something. And so I definitely think the idea of having a practice and this simple idea of grades now allows us to have more equity and inclusion with how we think about what this grade may mean. Or even, is the grading system that important? Are there other things that could be used to measure the students are learning what we believe they should be learning based on this syllabus? And so I definitely think when we think about this idea of our own practice, I think it starts with us in reimagining our community colleges, our communities, so that it starts this journey that they can be more just, equitable, and inclusive places.
Yes, thanks, Marlon. And thinking about our own practices within the institution, and are they valued or validated within the institution too? So as Marlon's pointing out, it's so important for us to have our own practices so that we don't re-wound or wound ourselves or others. And at the same time, recognizing how does the institution support us to keep those practices going, right? So when I did some research with interviewing faculty and staff at community college, I was most curious about this idea of the college itself as a contemplative institution, right? And so, someone need to mute. Okay, looking at the community college, yeah, as a contemplative institution, which meant that it's, an organization that encourages sharing perspectives, that communication can flow freely, where people learn together and think together, and there's a sense of goodwill and humor, right? And so looking at our community college spaces, do they feel contemplative, right? And so a couple of the things that came out of this research, it sort of was in the sort of macro realm and the micro realm. Folks were talking about the hierarchy and different departments and workload, such that you could move from one place in the institution to another and feel more or less contemplative, or you could be in one space in the hierarchy or in another and feel more or less contemplative. Folks talked about, especially in the last couple of years, how authentic are our conversations about equity, right? So 2019 and 2020 happened, and we're here. How do we trust, if a lot of the conversations that have been happening, the formation of diversity, equity, inclusion programs and so on, how much can we trust that they'll go the long haul, right? And then within the microsphere of our classrooms, one adjunct instructor talks about gatekeeping. She explained, she said, someone's attitude can be either we're here to work together, or the attitude can be more of a gatekeeper. She said, I really hope that my students encounter more of the former, because I worry about the damage that the latter can do. I often encounter community college students, and she said, and this is a broad generalization, who are less likely to question authority than students maybe at other places. And she said she hopes she provides a space where people feel like they can question her and bring themselves into that space. So as educators, as staff folks, et cetera, at a community college, we need to think about, what do we expect from our students? And how do we show up embodied as we are, with our social locations of race, class, gender, sexuality, heritage, language, all the things that brought us into the room, right? That may impact the relationships we can build. People talked about their positionality. One white male instructor talked about how he might show up to a room and how that might feel. And also a Black woman instructor talked about her having her own contemplative practices, but wondering if she shared them with students, would she be seen as intellectual enough in that space, right? So looking at who gets to use contemplative practices, who are we gatekeeping, who are we sharing with, and how does our space communicate that we're open. Language came up in conversation. I talked with one person who works with police recruits, and she said she can't use language like contemplative practice or mindfulness or meditation. She says things like get out of your head for a minute or give your brain a rest, get off the hamster wheel. She said, let's put it in the language of our audience. You've got to remember most of my recruits are individuals who never planned to go to college. They wanted to get out of high school. They thought they were going to wait a couple of years and become a police officer. I don't need to add another level of what I think they consider erudite. So thinking about, does this conversation, right, is it open to different classes, different social classes, different disciplines, and so on? How does it translate across the diversity that is a community college? Someone else brought up body size. She said, if you think about yoga in particular, think about the language of a full expression of a pose and a partial expression of a pose. She said that subtly validates one body type, one ability type in the room. She said, why don't we just say, hey, does this feel good in your body? Do this. If not, do this. Does this feel good in your body? Great, right? And so thinking about the ways our language polices people or includes people. And then finally, the notion of space. There are so many great examples of how people used space. I wish I could just sort of list them off. My favorite was one staff person providing tea. Sounds simple, but providing tea for students who came into our office. And think about that, being in a college environment and going into a space with a professional and being offered tea, right? How much more human you might feel in those spaces. But I think the best person to talk about space is Stephanie, and her perception of space breaks down some of our notions of space. So.
Okay, thank you, Amy. I just need to say that I'm in a laundry room, so I'm trying to figure out my space. I'm on a washing machine and I've got clothes all around me, so I'm just trying to make space. Anyway, I'll talk a little bit about language and space because I think it's complex. I teach it as an abstract notion. And I'm thinking about this because just recently I went to an exhibit of works by Laurie Anderson at the Hirshhorn Museum in DC, and she quoted William S. Burroughs, and he said, he refers to language as a virus from outer space that made the spoken word possible. So this really makes me chuckle. It's like, by eradicating language, we find our voices. For me, by eradicating language, we can find our voices. So when you think about a virus operates without human intervention. It attaches to things and it makes itself a host, and then we spread it around because they go from host to host. But language also infects us. It comes from outside of the human, and this was what Burroughs says. It powers. Well, this is a paraphrase of what he says. Its power derives from its ability to communicate or persuade. Its power derives not from its ability to communicate or persuade, but rather from its infectious nature, the power of bits of language to graft itself on other bits of language. I love this. And speaking and reproducing using human beings as hosts. So my thought is if we allow ourselves to simply uncover and discover our own voice, and much of that is possible, we can develop our own view. But this takes practice, because if we allow students to find their own view, that means we as teachers would have to have the ability to actually be open to that view. So this, in my opinion, is not an easy order, but this is when practice is important, because we have to allow for the spaciousness for that language or that non-language to evolve, right? So I'm thinking, rather than language, I use storytelling, right? But I use it as a non-verbal way of speaking. So through art and movement, with limited use of writing or language. So the key is having spaciousness, spaciousness, which is basically a mindfulness concept. And that means we're aware of the awakened being, right? And we are aware of our energy. We tap into the energy, our compassion, and our wisdom. So in order to do this, you have to have space. And we get to spaciousness. Because what I realized, there is no spaciousness in the classroom. So so in my head, it's a room that's divided by class, right? You have the smart kids and the ones who want to answer up in the front. And then you have the others who want to disappear into the background in the back. They're just like back there. And they don't want to be empowered. They're disempowered, right? So I thought that classrooms were a problem because they didn't allow for spaciousness. And we needed spaciousness to communicate wisdom. We needed spaciousness to be open to creation. So, and especially when you were thinking about developing community in a community college, where many of our students, most of our community colleges are commuter based. So building community becomes even more challenging. So this is what I would do. I would either find a dance studio, or we go to the gallery. I try to create assignments that would take us outside of our space, or I would create assignments outside of our space that had a theme or a topic, but we needed to be able to communicate without communicating about that topic. So I would use a variety of practices, and but the space was always the problem. You had to find a dance studio or an open space. So I would find a large classroom. I tell the students we're going to move the furniture, which is not something you're allowed to do. We'd move the furniture and we would create space, and we begin a series of practices of movement that allowed us to investigate challenging topics. So this incorporated deep listening. It incorporated the beginning of critical thinking, of an idea. So you present an idea, you present a series of exercises, and through nonverbal communication, you find ways of addressing that. And then when you start to verbalize, you give voice. You get the students' thoughts on that topic. And that's the beginning for me of critical thinking, because my problem with critical thinking is that, when you're 17, you may not have a lot to go on. So that's when you have to be open to what comes. And that's where practice comes in, because as teachers, you have to be grounded to take in ideas that seem like they are not right, but they are right. That is our responsibility, to be grounded enough to be able to hear it and then to begin that conversation. So I think that's all I'm going to say about non-language, the idea of, the virus of language and the beauty of non-language and words. So thank you.
So with our sort of research and our experience, and recognizing kind of in summary today, that, you know, we need our own practice. We hope that our practices are valued within the institution. We hope to find ways that our language and our space and the way we show up, you know, allows for an openness of our spaces so that more folks can recognize themselves as having their own practices to heal their own wounds, to experience a positive community college educational experience. So when we talk about what we imagine going forward, I knew that we were going to have some people in the room today, and we've had a chance to talk with folks from various community colleges. And I just want to give a shout out to some of the things that are going on that, and probably many things I don't know. But, you know, at the Community College of Baltimore County, there's a beautiful contemplative community circle that was founded by Stephanie. And now the coordinators are Dave Hewitt and Alyssa Sims-Clark. The Community College of Philadelphia, Elizabeth Cantonese and Kate Sanchez created a book. This book is the College Mindfulness Workbook, with great practices throughout that we can use with students. From Columbia College, Tamara Oxford, she talked about there being Mindful Mondays online during remote learning. At CUNY, there's just so many wonderful examples because they have so many campuses. And Joanne Chang shared about their mindfulness club. Delaware County Community College, Tanya Gardner and Francesco Bellini, I think some of you are here, talked about doing retreats and partnering with other community colleges to do those retreats. Hines Community College, which has a lot of allied health folks, right? So there's a lot of stress for nurses in training. Jennifer Smith, this was one of my favorites. When I emailed with her, she said, oh, I'm just now getting some painter's tape to make a labyrinth on the library floor. And I think it's a fantastically creative way to use space, right? Just as we were talking about, how do we use our space? How do we make our spaces feel contemplative? The New Hampshire Community College Network, that is Liz Korobek Emerson, shared that she teaches in a mindfulness communication course that's part of a certification program that's been around for 20 years. And Dan Houston created this book, Communicating Mindfully. In the South Puget Sound Community College, Tara Kuhn and Chandra Miller-Starks talked about these communities of practice, trauma-informed practice, mindfulness and technology. So we've got a lot of cool things happening across the country that are efforts to do just exactly what we're talking about here, which is, you know, to move us forward, to imagine a world forward where we can be contemplative, where our institutions can be contemplative. I'm grateful that folks were willing to share their experiences, and I hope that, you know, you can use the chat if you have other great ideas. And Marlon and Stephanie and David, if you'd like to weigh in on how we imagine going forward too.
Beats to it, Stephanie. No, no, I think I'll say it this way because I like try to be direct about it. But I think if community colleges hope that they survive in some shape, form, or fashion, we have no other choice but to be innovative and to think differently about what the experience means for the students and the staff who are on our campuses. So I definitely think when I think about imagining forward and looking to the future, as we think about the students, the diversity of students who are going to be coming to our campus, the amount of students who are coming to our campus with mental health challenges, issues around food insecurity, poverty. Matter of fact, their primary education experience is often not really great experiences. So we have students who are coming to our campuses who've been told they are dumb their whole lives, right? So how do we create spaces and opportunities for us to be able to be in community with each of those students? And I think as we also see the number of students who are graduating high school declines, and people like Google and Facebook are creating these certificate programs, they're not just competing with the big universities. Those certificate programs around computer engineering and technology that community colleges are offering are now being offered by Google. You can get in 6 months and they'll take your financial aid, right? So I definitely think we have no other choice as community colleges, as leaders, innovators, to reimagine what this is going to look like, because the landscape is changing daily and rapidly. And so I think we have no other choice but to put that mirror up and look in it and say, we got to make some different choices, because clearly what we're doing is not working. Students who are not graduating, terrible retention rates, staff members who are not paid for their worth, all of these things, I think we have to think differently about it. And I think being able to sit in our practices in the incorporation of contemplative practices with theory and these other mechanisms, I think can create an opportunity where we can reimagine very equitable, inclusive, and just places for everyone.
Thank you, Marlon. You know, I'm out. I retired about, it's close to 2.5 years ago, from teaching at a community college, and I don't think about it an awful lot until I'm placed in the position to think about it, because when you're retired, you don't have to think about anything anymore, unless you want to think about it. So what I want to bring up is something that Marlon brought up, was about the importance of having a practice. I think if there's nothing more important now for faculty and staff is to have a practice, and to ground themselves to be ready for the work ahead. And I say this because I work with the Association for American Colleges and Universities, and in their STEM initiative. And the fact that they have determined, this is undergraduate STEM, that they have determined that mindfulness is key. That they're realizing that the more they are training faculty and staff in mindfulness, that they will be able to retain, they're hoping to be able to retain more students, particularly students of color, in the classroom. And so I've been working with them now for 5.5 years, and it leads me to consider that community colleges have to do much the same, and it is finding the resource and the resources, both the physical resource and the emotional resources to do this kind of work, to understand, as we're doing at AAC&U right now, how to even deal with administration. So you have to be grounded, and then you have to understand how administration works to change administration. So I'm really talking about the real deal here, mindfulness, and like going and knowing that in order to make change, to really see change, that with our practice and with our knowledge of understanding how the administration works, that we can make incremental change. And I'm finding that the incremental change that they want to do in STEM is grounded in mindfulness. So, but of course they have to kind of disguise it. So when you were talking about language, what is this? Well, we're doing, contemplative. Nobody knows what that means. So, you use these terms and you begin to manipulate and work with this, do this work. But at the same time, your practice is what grounds you. Your practice is what's going to make the shift. Your practice is going to be the vision for our future and for the future of community colleges. So I think during this last year and 2 years, I've learned from AAC&U and watching them transform because there's a transformation. They brought me in not knowing what they wanted. And then to see transformation happen and begin to happen, and it's a process. I think this is what community colleges have to be able to do. I think maybe we have to come together more. We have to work together more. We need to have perhaps a contemplative conference just for community college people that will help us get to the next, just make the next step, just the next step. So anyway, that's all I got to say. Those are my thoughts. Thank you.
I have so many thoughts. That was, wow. Thank you. To your question, Amy, when I'm thinking about it in the sort of how do we reimagine the space, is that I'm having conversations every day with people in the contemplative movement that are talking about mindfulness, but very rarely talking about heartfulness, right? And I know I get pinged on this a lot in conversations because, oh, you always want to talk about love, right? But that is the key. In addition to conditioning the mind to be able to be aware and to accept things and let them go, how do we rest within our bodies just as they are and understand our own sort of space and place in the world as being spacious, right? If we develop it, there is a rich interior world, right, that could also be spacious. And so I'm thinking about love, right? And Marlon listed a number of qualities that are sort of encapsulated in love: discipline, commitment, community, acknowledgement, respect, acceptance, right? All of those are components of love. Love, not sentimentality or mush. And so how do we infuse these spaces with love, with heartfulness, right? We're educating the mind, but we're also forming the heart at the same time. And in some cases, we're repairing the heart that has been deeply wounded through the education they're pursuing. And so looking at community colleges, this is my reimagine, right? If I were to reimagine community colleges, education in general, I would say that we have to equally focus on the mind and the heart. And we have to understand that this woundedness that we carry as teachers, if we have a practice, as all of you have said, can be transformed into wisdom, right? Wounds can be transformed into wisdom so that we are a little bit more informed when our students are going through these things. We can see it. We know how to advise it. My grandmother always says, don't give advice, right? But ask questions. We know the right questions to ask of students who we can perceive are going through these things. And then I love, Stephanie, this whole conversation on language, right? I studied, one of my mentor teachers was a post-structuralist, and she always said, language speaks us, right? Be mindful of the language you use because it speaks us. And so to me, that was a challenge to make up my own damn language. Only because the academy is what it is, I've strung words together by hyphens, right? To make up my own language, because language cannot adequately speak us into the world. But movement can, but rhythm can, but humming can, right? Vibration can. And so bringing some of that, as you've noted, into the classroom environment, where there may not be any spaciousness, but I believe what Bell Hooks said is true, right? The classroom remains the most radical space of possibility on a campus. And she also said that healing is a communal act, right? You can heal alone, but it is an act where you call on everything and everybody to come into the room to help you heal. And the last thing I'll say is that, for me, healing is action, right? And this is so kind of anti-contemplative practice, right? We're always talking about how do you be, right? But what do I do as well, right? I know I need to be a certain way, but what do I do? And doing together, right? Collective action yields transformation. So if we can all come together and say, hey, we don't like the way this is going. We have to transform this thing, but I need to work on me, you work on you, we're gonna work on ourselves together. And then we're gonna get in the room and talk about how we're gonna kick some ass to transform this thing forward, right? I think that's what I'm imagining.
And I'll quickly say it now because I know we're gonna move on. And David, when we find ourselves being moved in positions that we can lean into that practice, that we don't reify the same will, that we have the ability to have the courage to have that paradigm shift, that there may be people, as the young kids say, there may be some haters, you know, they just gonna hate along the way, right? But you have to be willing to have the courage to like make that shift because you know it's the right thing to do in the beauty of our community. So I'm done. Stephanie, I didn't preach tonight, I promise. So I think I'm the last slide anyway. So I think as we close our time here, I think one of the things I think for our closing, as I think we've all pointed out, that this work really starts with the individual, with each one of us. And so we'll do like Mr. Rogers style. I'll keep the time. So we're gonna do about 2 minutes of this. But so what I want each of us to think about is in the imagining the future of community colleges, what can you do in your locus of control to imagine a more just, equitable, and inclusive community college? So take about a minute to think through what that means. How do you and what can you do in your locus of control to create a more just, equitable, and inclusive community college? So think about that for about a minute or so. So I know a lot of us may have a lot of thoughts about what we could do. So of all the things you've thought about, what I would like for you to do, if you got a piece of paper or something around you, I want you to write down one of those things. Sometimes it don't have to be a lot. So what is that one thing that you can think about it, take as your practice to do, as David points out about it, the action that it takes to reimagine. So use this time to write that statement down. So as we close our time here, I think whenever you find yourself feeling like you're on an island or need a little bit more courage, that statement that you have written down, I hope that all of you can use it as some instrument to continue to move forward. And Stephanie says you can put it in the chat if you'd like to, and you can, again, that's a sense of community and accountability as well. And so definitely when we do feel that time of struggle, strain, frustration, hopefully we all can use that time that statement to help us to continue to reimagine more just, equitable, and inclusive community colleges. So.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marlon, Amy, Stephanie. We do have a couple of questions if you're open to taking them in the Q&A. The first question is from Simon or Simone, not so sure. Could you please say more about how to link contemplative practices and critical thinking? How can we guide students into first-person critical thinking practices?
You know, the way that I did this was I would create these. I'm trying to think of a practice that I did. I would give them scenarios. I would put them into small groups in an open space, and I would put on a piece of paper a scenario that requires maybe 3 people decide what role they had and how they're going to resolve something. And so they would get this little piece of paper, and they would have, I don't know, 3-4 minutes to determine who played what role, and that they were going to present it. I mean, they were going to present it. We're going to see it visually and understand how they make this choice, and they will act it out. And it was an interesting exercise because I would use it in the context of what we were researching. So and sometimes they had not visited and had researched this information yet. So they have to think creatively on how to resolve and how, what is the problem. And it doesn't matter that it's not quite right. It just matters that they were able to think through it and explain how they made the choice that they made and how that choice impacted the other 2 individuals. And sometimes it could mean that one individual did not get what they wanted. So they had to be able to determine that. And then we would go back and do a reflection on what occurred. The reflection would come from the folks that were viewing it, and the reflection would come from the individuals that finally actually presented it, because things change as they're up there and they're starting to realize, oh, wait a minute, that really doesn't work. And now they have to work in that moment to make that determination. So it's an interesting exercise. I studied with Meredith Monk for quite a bit, and that was one of these exercises that I brought back and thought about how I could use that in the classroom to engage in critical thoughts about things that they didn't know anything about. So how do you get them to think through something that they're unfamiliar with? And how do we sit with, and like I said, sit with it to accept some of that truth, and that's practice.
David, do you mind one quick thing on that too? I think the other thing that I'll say about this experience, and I'll say sometimes I'm guilty of this too, but I think as faculty members, we have to also be willing to change our curriculums and our approaches when we think about what materials am I using. Am I using books that are written by people from my community, or the shared experiences of the students who are coming into our space? Often it's hard for some students. I mean, yeah, you can give me Shakespeare. Okay, I can get it. But yeah, I understood growing up in Mississippi about William Faulkner, because I understood that experience of what that meant of living in Mississippi, or whether Red Fern, whatever, pick a book, Richard Wright. We can go on all day about that, right? So I definitely think that experience, that when we think about critical thinking and what we hope our students get out of it, I think we also have to have the ability and the courage to think about, well, what am I providing? And does that create the opportunity for students to think differently? And I think the last thing I'll say is sometimes it's just a simple activity, or I know one of my final is this: tell me what you learned. And I'm able to I don't know what they got out of it, but it allows them to be able to tell me what they got out of this experience. And for me to be able to sit with that and not, be in my little vacuum of saying they better have gotten this. Some of them never get what you thought. And it was probably more important of that thing to them than what you were trying to teach them in some ways. But again, that also helps us to be able to think like, okay, people saw it a different way. And so I definitely think that idea of even changing the locus of control, allowing the students to say, well, you tell me what you learned, instead of these prompts we give, though they're nice and they're cute, but I think it can also change the dynamic too in the classroom. So
thank you.
Yeah, amen. I also think too, when we think of contemplative practice, we're often thinking about meditation or um, uh, more sort of quiet experiences of practice. But there are plenty of ways, just as Stephanie was sharing, to incorporate things like pedagogy of the oppressed or theater of the oppressed is what I was thinking as you're sharing, where people act out different social problems or social ideas. But also, thinking about how do we put information at students, right? So sometimes we're going at such a quick pace that critical thinking is very hard to do. So sometimes I'll just, in my field is social science, and so we're dealing a lot with graphs and charts and tables, and we're just racing through them and look at this and all these bars that actually represent real people, right? And so if we put up a chart we want our students to learn about, what about pausing there? And that activity is called beholding, right? How do we just sort of sit with, we don't have to tell them, hey, we're going to behold right now, guys. You're losing everybody, right? But instead we could sort of just sit, take a beat, breathe 10 times. Works every time to handle the awkwardness of the silence, right? But this idea of sitting with it and finding ourselves in those images, or asking questions like, who's represented here and who's not represented here, right? Just give students a chance to sort of really make that personal connection with what we're teaching, so that then critical thinking can happen. Because once I know how I'm there, then it becomes relevant to me, right? And so I think sometimes we're thinking of contemplative practices in one way, but I know when I've talked with people who are, particularly in the STEM fields, using things like beholding is really useful, because otherwise we're going at a pace that no one can consume.
Yeah, I love that. And I think to piggyback on that, I'm going to be in conversation with Deb Dana and Rob Priest next week. And one of the things that we talked about in our initial session from Rob Priest was that after practice, after we do a practice, do we ever ask, how did that make you feel? Right? Are you okay with that? How does your body feel, right? And so we tend, in our academic environments, we tend to focus so heavily on the thinking, right, that we forget about the understanding. So perhaps the question is not about critical thinking, but what did you understand about this subject? And how does that make you feel? Maybe those are the two critical questions, right? To get folks to be reflexive and to develop deep understanding, rather than trying in some very dominating way to shape their thinking. Does that make any sense? And I am a proponent of critical thinking. So don't get me wrong. Like, I am like, we need more critical thinking in classrooms. This is crazy. These kids can't think out of a paper bag. And I have said that before, right? But now I'm thinking about, like, wait, but how do they feel, right? Did they come into the classroom able to receive whatever I'm trying to transmit to them? And we all know that if you ain't ready to receive it, it ain't gonna be received. Right? I don't care what it is. So there is a way to set the environment for reception. And I think that's what practice could do in a classroom or in any environment. All right, I'm gonna go to a comment here from Mark. I think this ties back to what Amy was sharing about community as local, national, and global. We have to be contemplative at the individual, classroom, department, and the institutional level to make a real shift. I agree with that. And I would add, maybe we have a couple more seconds, right? But not only be contemplative, but be contemplatives in action. We forget about the action piece, right? I can compassionately tell you off. This is not just about being silent and sitting our pillows, right, and doing those sorts of things, but it is an active endeavor. And I think sometimes I've gotten caught up in this too, is that in a boardroom, right, you go in thinking, I need to be contemplative, I need to be peaceful, I need to set the environment for peace and for compassion and all of those things, but I also need to tell the truth. And the truth is painful if you're telling it right. And so those things also have to sort of be be grappled with. The others here are all comments, and I'm going to skip over them because we are at our time. And so what I would ask is each of you in 1 minute, give us a sentence on what you hope we take away from tonight's conversation.
I think for me, the sentence would be that the work to be done to be more just, equitable, and inclusive is hard, rewarding, frustrating, stressful, and it's an ongoing process. But what I think is important is for all of us to remember to stay grounded and stay in community and be willing to stay at the table, to understand that we are just one small microcosm in the lineage of change. And so I will hope that when we do find ourselves in this work, that we remember that it's important to be grounded in it.
Yes. Looking at Renee says kindness for yourself may mean breaking silence. And I was thinking, um, yes, be grounded, be fearless, be open, be willing, be love. Um, yeah, I'm going to stick with that right now.
Thank you for that question. So much for this presentation. I was thinking about the questions, right? And I think that's one thing I'll take is this, the valuing of asking the question. And David, as you suggested to us to look at this sort of mind-heart connection, what questions do I need to ask myself and how will I honestly answer them in the context of my work at the community college in relationship to that mind-heart connection? Yeah. That's what I wrote down as my sentence, Marlon, and now I feel responsible for it. Thank you.
Love that. Love that. I want to thank the three of you so much for this conversation, for the presentation, for the informative and heartfelt way you moved us through tonight's discussion. I am moved and touched, and I've learned a lot. I have 3 pages of notes. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Before we end tonight's broadcast, I would like to remind folks to please take our survey, which will be dropped in the chat. Let us know your thoughts about tonight's event. And if you have your credit cards handy, we would appreciate a donation to CMind in whatever amount you see fit and are willing to keep these types of programs going. Okay? I am so glad, again, that we touched the wound, we confronted the wound to begin to heal it tonight. I'm so grateful again to each of the presenters for engaging the imagination, which I think is the most intimate part of the mind. And when we collectively engage, it is a powerful, powerful force of transformation. The imagination, as Amiri Baraka wrote in 1965, quote, is a practical vector from the soul that is all possibility. Baraka reminds us that it is possibility that moves us. It is possibility that moves us to act, to be differently, to transform, to educate, to love, and to create a new world. I hope that we were as moved by the possibility of the new at community colleges as I was in this conversation tonight. I invite all of you to join us on Thursday, April 21st for Healing Higher Education, Racial Reckoning, Racial Justice with Professor Rhonda McGee and Dr. Tia Brown McMahon. It will be a dynamic conversation you will not want to miss. My wish for you in closing is that you sit, give rest, you breathe, you cry, you sob, walk, run, imagine, and pray. Until then, be well, be still. Trust in the infinite. Remember our shared humanity. Be community. And please be of good courage. Good night.